apocalyptic moralists who want to save the planet, let's say, still are putting forward the story that what we're doing is not, quote, sustainable, that we need 5 Earths to feed everyone on the planet at the level that the West currently enjoys. And their what would you call, recipe for future progress is a limits to growth model. And the problem with the limits to growth model is, well, first of all, it's hypocritical because the people who are proposing it aren't going to be the people who are suffering from it. That's for sure. And second, it's wrong technically because, and I think you did a good job of pointing this out in the Oxford speech, poor people can't care about long-term sustainability and iterability. They're so busy scrabbling in the dirt for their next meal, trying to get fresh water, access to basic hygiene facilities, the next meal, that anything approximating a medium to long-term vision is out of their reach. And so they sacrifice the future to the present so they can survive. But if you get people up to about $5,000 per year in gross domestic product productivity per capita, they immediately start to take a longer view. And I figured this out about 15 years ago when I was perversely working on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, trying to make them less socialist and destructive than they were. And it looked to me like we could have our cake and eat it too, that the best policy possible to produce a, quote, sustainable planet would be a one that ameliorates poverty, especially on the energy front, as rapidly as possible. And so that's part of a positive vision.
I agree completely. And look, I'm by no means a climate expert, but even as just an outside observer, someone whose primary job is podcaster and satirist, I can see that a lot of the narratives that we have, they seem to have more in common with a religious worldview or a cult-like worldview than they do with a practical attempt to solve the real problems that we face. And I was born in the Soviet Union and I've lived all over the world in many poor countries. So, I don't have we talk so much about privilege nowadays in our society, Jordan. We've got male privilege and white privilege and all sorts of other privilege. The main privilege that we don't talk about is Western privilege. And it takes Western privilege to fail to understand that what you just said, which is that poor people don't care about quote unquote saving the planet because they've got more immediate priorities. And so even if you accept the entirety of the climate change argument, and this is the point that I made in the speech, whining about it or reducing consumption in Britain, which produces 1% of global carbon emissions and is responsible for another 1%, so in total 2%, it makes no difference. It will not solve the problem when China and India are busy trying to get their people to avoid starving to death. And so what I see is a kind of doomsday cult that seems to have taken over, and politically we seem to be pandering to that instead of dealing with the real challenges of the world. And by the way, it clearly has impact all over the place. I mean, if you look at what happened in Germany, Germany, for purely political and ideological reasons, shut down its nuclear power stations. It's now paid South Africa, and Michael Schellenberger covered this on his Substack, paid South Africa to not use coal. Well, now what? Now they import coal back from South Africa and burn it. And also, of course, they made themselves extremely dependent on Russian gas at the time, which I hope the war in Ukraine is something we get on to talking about.
Yes, I hope so too. Well, yeah, so what you get in Germany is the worst, and for all those people who are watching and listening who might have environmental concerns, look, if you have environmental concerns, one of your goals is, in principle, to improve the environment. Now, if you implement a set of policies that make energy 5 times as expensive, which is what's happened in Germany, and you improve things on the pollution front, at least you could say, well, energy is much more expensive, and that's pretty hard on the poor people. But look, we've accomplished one of our own goals. And, you'd have to contend seriously with an opponent who put forward an argument like that. But if the reality on the ground is, well, we made energy 5 times as expensive, we've made ourselves hyper-reliant on the Russians and a single point of failure on the energy front, and we're producing far more pollution, particularly in relationship to coal burning, and the grid is much less reliable than it used to be. It's like, Well, you didn't just fail according to my definition of failure. You failed according to your definition of failure. And so how in the world is that even possibly justified? And then I think we get into the religious realm here at that point. And so Alex Epstein has done a pretty good job of laying this out. I like Lomberg on the IPCC front, and we'll get back to that, accepting the idea that there will be something like 2 degrees of climate change in the next 100 years and figuring out what to do with that. But Epstein has pointed out in his new book, Fossil Fuel Future, he laid out something I'd also investigated in my Maps of Meaning book, this underlying religious narrative. And it's basically a Gaia narrative. It's an earth-worshipping metaphysic, and it is a religious in its implicit structure. And the idea is that the planet is a hapless, fragile virgin threatened by a rapacious, consuming, tyrannical giant, and that's society, and that the individual is a parasitical predator riding the back of that rapacious monster. And that is a religious narrative, and it's religious because it's a fundamental narrative that frames everything else, and it also partakes of the archetypal underlying structure that makes religious stories religious. And so you could conjure up an opposite story, right? And this would flesh out the religious landscape. The opposite story would be nature is a hideous Gorgon-like demon who's hell-bent at every aspect to freeze us into terror and devour us. So that's nature red in claw and tooth. Culture is the walled garden. It's the walls of the walled garden that protects us from the absolute ravages of nature. And the human being is a heroic enterpriser bent on entering into a relationship with the planet and with culture that approximates something like environmental stewardship. It's a much more positive vision. Now, it casts nature into disrepute and probably elevates culture to unidimensionally. But you need both sides of that picture in order to have a complete picture of the world. So kids are being offered an incomplete religious view of the world that's focused on nature as hapless virgin. And so everything is being sacrificed to her. And that's complicated by another fact. And Constantine, I think this has to do with the problem that the conservatives and the liberals, for that matter, real liberals, haven't been able to come up with a promising vision. Is that, well, adolescents enter this period that Jean Piaget called the messianic. Now, not everyone gets to that point, but relatively cognitively sophisticated kids do. And so this is about age 16 to 20, let's say. This is also when you want to induct kids into the armed forces if you actually want to manage it effectively. It's really when their final touches of their enculturation occur. It's when their prefrontal cortexes prune themselves most thoroughly. That happens also between the ages of 2 and 4, but it happens between 16 and 20. You sort of die into your adult self. Anyways, Piaget noted that people of that age, cross-culturally, have a desire to identify with a purpose that transcends themselves, and that would be cultural identity, right? And they need that. They find it in music often. They find it in their subcultures, but they need to be offered that. And there's something heroic about it because they actually do want to look outside themselves. And then, the radical, envious lefties come along and say, well, all you have to do is wave a placard at an oil company, and now you're culture hero of the universe and, standing next shoulder to shoulder with the Messiah himself. And that's pretty damn appalling, and it's certainly not true. But in the absence of an alternative vision, then people are going to gravitate towards that as they do. And so you can't exactly blame young people for that, even though it's tempting.